Welcome in, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to Tuesday afternoon. Hope you are enjoying your Tuesday so far. We're glad to be with you today. And also, this is the time slot that we're going to be on for next week as well. So this week and next week, Tuesday, 3 p.m. Just because, life is life and life happens. And Pastor Matt has children he needs to attend to, and I have a father who I care about, and I'm going to spend his birthday with him. So, the Tuesday today, well, you're here anyway, and then Tuesday next week as well, 3 p.m. Be there for that, and then I believe we probably will be back to the normal run of the gamut in terms of 3 o'clock Thursday after that.
Probably.
So, probably. We'll let you know.
Lord willing.
Lord will,
as the book of James teaches
Lord
us to
willing,
say.
the creeks don't rise.
Yes.
That's a shout out to Rich Shell. He always used to say that in my counseling classes with him. So,
yeah. The creek does rise around here.
It does rise. I was talking to Jerry about that one day. I was like, it was actually it was one of the days where the creek was flooding and it was really high. And I was like, well, if I don't make it to work tomorrow, I'll see you tomorrow, Jerry. Lord willing, the creeks don't rise. And it was very literal.
Probably the first time you ever used that literally.
Yeah, it was literal in terms of, Anyway, glad to have you with us. I am Pastor Jack, and this is
Pastor Matt.
And I am the associate minister here. He is a senior minister here, which means he's my boss, which means I, have to behave myself on the live stream. So
you can't trust any opinion he gives of me during this because it's coerced.
Yeah, right. Talking about being forced into things.
Yes.
Those are some of the questions that are going to come up. So,
yeah.
Anyway, no, it's all good. It's all good. We have a wonderful working relationship. But here's how it's going to work today. This is deleted scenes, and so that's just what we do is we get together and we talk about some things that maybe didn't make the cut for the sermon on Sunday, this most recent Sunday. And I have some questions for Pastor Matt from the sermon that might help us dive deeper into some different subjects. And you also can comment any questions you might have for Pastor Matt in regards to the sermon. I mean, I guess you can ask him questions that are not in regards to the sermon, but right now it's kind of for the topic of the sermon, which was Simon Peter and how he was called by Jesus into being a disciple. And so Luke's kind of version of that. So, but we are talking about that today. And so I have several questions for Pastor Matt that I'm going to ask him. And throughout this time, if you have any question you might have, feel free to throw that in the comments section and we will get to it as soon as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to start with our first question. And since we are talking about Simon Peter, I just wanted to ask, what more do we know about him that you might not have included in the sermon? So you kind of talked about him and his occupation and his brother Andrew. What more do we know about Simon Peter?
So we don't know a whole lot else in terms of his history before Jesus. We know that he was married because he has a mother-in-law, and we also know that his wife was still alive afterward, and he was traveling with her because if you remember from last week when we read a passage where Paul talks about preachers taking their wives with them, he lists Peter as one of those who's known for doing that. He was born in Bethsaida, and he worked in Capernaum. One of the interesting things that archaeologists have discovered is a church, a very, very old church from like the first couple centuries that was claimed to have been built in Peter's house, out of Peter's house, that where Jesus healed his mother-in-law. So it's very possible that archaeologists actually have Peter's home in Capernaum. Still, like they've actually discovered it. His father's name was John or Jonah. That's basically what we know from before Jesus. After Jesus, we know the stories in Acts about him traveling around. Ultimately, he ended up in Rome. And tradition, pretty strong tradition, tells us that he was crucified upside down by Nero. There's pretty much no reason to doubt he was killed by Nero. But the tradition is that he didn't feel worthy to die the same way as Jesus. So he asked, when he was going to be crucified, he asked to do it upside down.
Interesting. So one of the things that you brought up in the sermon is kind of how Peter is critical, and that we see that from beginning to end of his story, where he thinks critically. But you also brought up the fact that Andrew is very hopeful, and so he believes in Jesus kind of from the get-go, whereas Peter needs a little bit of convincing. And so I want to ask, within ourselves, but also in general, like in a workplace or in a working relationships, how important is it to have both critical thinking, but also kind of a hopeful outlook on things?
I think the church definitely needs both. I mean, there's no sense that Peter's personality changed in that regard. Like he became a golden retriever, hopeful kind of person like Andrew. He just was a critical person who was convinced. Mm-hmm. And I think that both of those perspectives are helpful because you need people who are hopeful, who are ready and willing to believe, but you also need people who are willing to test those beliefs. You know, like in Scripture, it tells us that we're supposed to test the spirits. We're not supposed to just automatically assume that anything a believer says is from the Holy Spirit really is. And you know, there have been some very strange notions passed around in the church with the Holy Spirit's name on it, and it requires some healthy skepticism. But if all we ever have is healthy skepticism, then we're never actually going to be ready to believe what the Holy Spirit really does say. So, you know, we were talking about the fact that we kind of fall into different camps. I tend to be more of a critical, skeptical is not quite the right word, but I tend to be harder to convince. I tend to be less inclined to believe, while you said that you tend to be more of a hopeful kind of person. Mm-hmm. And I think those two play off each other well.
Yeah. As I was thinking about it, I think it's also kind of reflected in our preaching sometimes, you know, mm-hmm. where also kind of your background in, you know, your education in terms of politics and things like that, and arguing different things, you know. Whereas I very much kind of lean towards like this kind of emotional side of things, of just like, look how hopeful this is, you know, look how exciting this is. And not to say that, you know, either way of preaching is right or wrong. I think it's just good to have both perspectives in there, mm-hmm. and also working both perspectives into ourselves individually. You know, it's something that I kind of want to work into myself, of like being able to argue kind of the ways that you do when you preach as well. So yeah.
And I've spent a long time and continue to work on trying to be more hopeful, because there are things I miss out on because I'm inclined to not believe that they're going on, or not believe that that's what God is doing. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
So the next question that I want to ask is this. So with this story of Peter, we kind of see this concept of Jesus kind of convincing Peter that he is who he says he is. And so I want to ask, with stories like this, what differences might we see in stories where the character kind of just automatically, they already believe, they're already fully in? How does Jesus respond to these people in different ways than how he responded to Peter?
There are a lot of stories in the Gospels about people who believe before the miracle. Mm-hmm. And the story but the comment that Jesus makes that just now when you were saying that, it made me think of, is actually what he says to Thomas. Thomas is one of those who has to see the miracle first, and specifically the resurrection. He has to see Jesus and get the same evidence that the other disciples got. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we call Thomas doubting Thomas because he asked for evidence. He actually asked for the same evidence that the other disciples got. But Jesus says, you believe because you see. Blessed are those who haven't seen but still believe. He's basically talking about everybody else who's going to have to believe in the resurrection without having lived through it. And in those moments, Jesus seems to have a special compassion and a special grace for those people. Mm-hmm. Another example is the woman with the bleeding issue. Mm-hmm. That you and I were talking about earlier, you brought up how she just believes that Jesus is going to heal her, and she touches him. And Jesus shows extraordinary compassion there. There are also times when Jesus calls people out for wanting a sign from him. And he says, a sinful, adulterous generation demands a sign. So there definitely is this sense that we're not supposed to be waiting on miracles to convince us.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that Peter was waiting on a miracle. Peter didn't say, "Hey, if you fill my net with fish, I'll believe you." Peter didn't ask for it. So I think that's actually another example of grace that Jesus gives him exactly what he needs to come to that place.
Yeah.
So Jesus just seems to approach people with different personalities in different ways. And that's one of the things I love about him is you read how he deals with people in the Gospels.
Yeah, it almost seems as though Peter's never really testing Jesus. One of the things he kind of talked about is, he views Jesus as just another one of the teachers that's coming to town. So it's like, maybe Jesus sees that and says, he's not doubting me per se. He just kind of thinks of me as one of the other guys that's coming to teach, and so I need to prove to him that I'm not just another teacher, that I am the Messiah. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about how Jesus kind of revealed himself to Peter in a very personal and clear way. So I just wanted to ask, what personally might you view as a personal and clear way that Jesus might reveal himself to you, or would have if you were Peter?
How hypothetically?
Yeah, hypothetically.
If I was Peter, how would Jesus? Oh, that's hard. Man, because being a pastor puts me already in a religious context. Think about how he would reveal himself to me when I was an electronics salesman. Wow, what would only? That's hard. If I'm thinking hypothetically, like if I met Jesus, I don't know. In terms of the way Jesus reveals himself to people today, Jesus has revealed himself to me through people with particular kinds of character. I think people, and this I think is going to come up in 2 weeks from now, I think in a sermon, but Jesus really revealed himself to me in people who had Christ-like character where I didn't expect it, where I had been taught not to expect it, where I was stereotyping people as incapable of having it. And so that's how I've encountered Jesus, really, is in the character of people that I've met. I've met some very Christ-like people where I didn't expect to see them, and it really shook up my expectations. Yeah. So, again, being kind of a skeptical person, I'm not inclined to expect good things from people necessarily, especially if I've got some kind of stereotyped prejudice against them. And so for Jesus to shake that up, for me to find changed people where I don't expect to find changed people, that was kind of my fish in the boat kind of a thing.
Yeah. Awesome. Don't forget, you can comment any questions you might have at Pastor Matt, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. I wanted to ask, since we're kind of focusing on the account of Luke, it is quite different than the other accounts of the Gospels. And so I just want to ask, how appreciative should we be for this account from Luke, and why?
I think Luke, each of the Gospels has their own character and their own value. Luke is unique in that he is he is exactly what he says he's going to be in the introduction. He's orderly. Things have a natural, they have a sensible sequence in terms of where Jesus is going and how the events fit together to tell a story. Mm-hmm. And Luke also really focuses on personal encounters. So even Peter in the Gospel of Mark is based on Peter's teaching, and Peter and Matthew, in both those places, Jesus just shows up and says, "Follow me," and they follow. And like I said in the sermon, that's the most important part of the story, clearly. But Luke gives us these moments of people encountering Jesus and what that feels like, and especially people that we don't expect Jesus to talk to. Yeah. So there's a lot of those individual kind of redemption stories in Luke, and that's really, really valuable. Matthew is really valuable, and we're going to talk about this next Sunday because the sermon's on Matthew, about how valuable what he has to offer is, because he offers us so many of Jesus's teachings, and so much of the most important words ever said by any human being, so many of those are in Matthew exclusively. And so he really gives us a picture of Jesus as a teacher that is really valuable. Yeah. And Mark just gives you the 16 chapters, cut and dry, get to the point kind of approach.
So maybe you could help us just really quickly. What is each gospel trying to accomplish? just with how they write. What might Luke be trying to accomplish? Gospel of John, that one's kind of wild and out there. What's he trying to accomplish within his gospel?
There are a lot of theories about how and why the Gospels were written and who they were written for. And so we basically speculate based on what's in them. Who do they seem to be talking to? Matthew, the most logical assumption is that Matthew, because he has so much teaching and so many Old Testament references, he is trying to convince people that Jesus is the Old Testament Messiah. And so people have made assumptions then about, like, Matthew was writing his gospel to a particular audience, like a particular community. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think it doesn't so much reflect his target audience. I think the gospels were probably written, they just wrote it for everybody and anybody. But I think it reflects what the author thought was important and what the author was experience showed and people needed. And so he thought it was really important to show Jesus is the Messiah of the Old Testament. Luke, I think, really wanted to show people that Jesus is the Savior of the lost, of the rejected. He really wants to show people, because he has much less focus on Israel and brings in a lot more Gentiles. And so he seems to generally be focused on reaching a wider range of people. Mark, I think, is really focused on getting to people as quickly and efficiently as possible exactly who Jesus is. That seems to be what the stories of Mark focused around. And then John wants to give us the fullest picture of who Jesus is and of what his role is in our in Christianity. And he gives us the fullest exploration of Jesus's character and his nature and his place in God's plan.
All right. So before we get to the next, it's kind of a section that's tied together by one theme. Before we get to that, don't forget that you can comment any questions that you might have in the comment section. But without further ado, the next section is kind of talking about this idea of people being forced to follow a certain thing. And so I first want to talk about, because you talk about how Jesus doesn't force people to follow him. And so what do we see in organizations where the opposite is true, where people are forced to follow what they believe and what they are teaching?
This is a very common phenomenon throughout human history. In fact, the idea of not being forced to believe a certain thing is pretty rare, although we take it for granted. Most recently, countries that have a dominant political ideology, like communist countries, where you are expected to believe in that party's philosophy, and you're just trained in it. Although I guess to a certain extent we have the same thing, because we are trained to believe in small d democratic ideals, not the Democratic Party, but the ideals of the Constitution, and of that, just the idea that people should be in charge. The people should be in charge. But before America came along, every country kind of decided for themselves what everyone was going to believe, and so Christian countries did that. So you would actually, like, your baptism would be part of your citizenship and like your birth records. You would be, and the clergy were, the priests and pastors were state officials who did state functions. It's one of the reasons why we have marriage licenses. And then there's also, of course, stories of it being spread more violently in in Islam. That tended to be the way it was spread. And in all of these phenomena, what you find is very few people are actually sincere about what they believe. And it's very hard to clearly see what that movement stands for, because it gets tied up in so many other agendas. So one of my big theological influences is a guy named Søren Kierkegaard, who lived in early 19th century Denmark. He talks a lot about this, about how when everybody's a Christian, when being a Christian is just part of living, then nobody's a Christian, because being a Christian means being called out to be something different. And so it just waters down everything. You always find that when you require something, it warps that ideology. So, like in China, for instance, communism has been warped because they're committed to being communist, but they're going to do whatever they feel like will best accomplish the agenda for the country.
Mm-hmm.
So they've actually done a lot of things that are very uncommunist because they have to keep that communist label. Same thing happens with Christianity when you're forced to keep it.
Yeah. Do you think this might be why? I'm not going to say that Jesus didn't care about it, but why Jesus seemed to kind of it just that wasn't the main concern was politics. The main concern was loving people, and whatever happened politically, if you love people, then it doesn't really matter in general, right?
I think I agree with what you're saying because that's how we would put it. The way we normally talk about politics. Mm-hmm. What I might say, to be a little more accurate in my mind, is it's not that he doesn't care about politics. He doesn't support or he doesn't use coercive politics. Mm-hmm. Coercive meaning having the force of the military. So that's the reason why people follow the laws of the government, is because there are more guns supporting the laws of the government than there are against it. And so when you have a law, it's enforced by violence. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times Christians get caught up in trying to get our doctrine enshrined in law so that it's enforced by violence. And Jesus is very clear that his politics is not enforced by violence. When he talks to Pilate during the crucifixion, he says, my kingdom is not of this world, which doesn't mean it's not in this world. It means it's not like the kingdoms of this world. And the main distinction is he doesn't have angels come down and defeat his enemies. Mm-hmm. That's what he says there. And so I think Jesus cares very much about politics in the sense of how our society works, but his way of accomplishing that is not coercion or force, it's compassion and love. Yeah. Which is just a longer way of saying what you already said. But I really want to challenge Christians to think of politics as a bigger word, that you can be involved in politics without getting partisan, because politics is how our society is run, how people are taken care of, and the gospel has everything to say about that without reducing it to simply, do you have an R or a D next to your name?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I wanted to ask about is, there will be people who would say, well, the church definitely tried to force me to believe. And so I just want to ask, coming from a pastor who kind of preached on this idea that Jesus doesn't want to force people to believe, what would your response to these people be?
Oh, I think it would depend on what their backstory is. If they're talking about being raised in Sunday school, I don't think that counts. And if you're talking about your parents raising you in Christianity, I would actually be more offended by a parent who believed something was true and didn't teach it to me. Mm-hmm. So I guess it depends on what you mean by forced. I think everybody who's raised in the church has to deal with that moment when you have to decide if you're going to take it on for yourself. Mm-hmm. I definitely had that moment. And now, if you're talking about, on the other hand, there are definitely individual experiences where somebody tried to convince you of the gospel very forcefully. Mm-hmm. And those can be very damaging. It can be very damaging when your fingers shook in your face and you say, you have to do this, even though you don't have to believe it. Mm-hmm. Technically, you can opt out, but you're a kid, or these are people that you trust or people that your parents have entrusted you to. Those kinds of experiences can be very, very hurtful and leave some very deep scars. And I have absolute compassion for that. And I think we need to remember that people are going to have to make these decisions on their own. Mm-hmm. And we have to be okay with people asking questions. Oftentimes the experiences that people are talking about is when they had legitimate questions, mm-hmm. and people got angry at them, shut them down, told them not to ask those questions. You just have to believe. And there's no sense in the Bible that we're not supposed to ask questions. There are whole books of the Old Testament that are just really pretty much asking questions. Ecclesiastes is a big question, and some really hard questions. Job has hard questions. The Psalms have hard questions, and we need to allow people the space to ask those questions. Christians should not be afraid of questions.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I was just watching something recently where someone, their story was, I went to the Christian church. I had grown up in the Christian church, but once I started having questions, people got very upset with me, and so I went and searched elsewhere for a different organization. They found one that seemed to answer their questions, but then didn't end up answering their questions anyway. And so they were broken. And what I took from that story is, wow, we had such a chance as the Christian church to welcome them and to love them and say, hey, maybe I don't know these answers, but maybe I do know these answers. Let's talk about them. Let's have conversations. But instead, they were just turned away, and that was really unfortunate to me, and broke my heart for that person. So,
well, I think we get insecure when people ask questions that we can't answer as Christians. Mm-hmm. I think I personally speculate that that's where a lot of that angry reaction comes from, is from people who feel insecure by that question. And I don't think, and we talked about this, I think it was last week, Christians shouldn't feel like we need to have all the answers. Nobody has all the answers. Nobody, like, the fact that there are things about in science, some obvious things that we don't understand. I think I talked about gravity. Mm-hmm. And nobody says, oh, well, you can't believe anything about science because they don't understand gravity. So I don't think we should be afraid of questions or feel insecure when we can't answer certain questions. Sometimes that can also be a sign that our theology doesn't actually work. A lot of times questions about predestination and things like that will expose flaws in our human systems of theology. And when we go back to Scripture, what we find is those systems are not in the Bible. Those are things we came up with. So it sometimes forces us to do more work on our faith. And sometimes we don't want to do that.
Yeah. So kind of considering this conversation and where it's kind of gone, I just want to ask, and this is a really tough question to word, and so I'm going to kind of trust you to not think that I'm trying to do something theologically that's completely wild. But, you know, the church, it involves people who are broken. Yes. And Jesus is very much unbroken, has a love that is unbroken. Mm-hmm. But when people become involved with Jesus, most often they become involved with the church as well. Uh-huh. And sometimes the church does something that's very hurtful to somebody. And so I'm just wondering, you know, with all this consideration, how important is it to kind of take the love of Jesus a little bit separately maybe from the church, and how one might have been hurt by the church? Mm-hmm. Because that's definitely not a reflection of Jesus and what he wants to do. Yeah. So what can you say to that? I probably worded that really weirdly.
No, I understand. I think on the one hand, we need to remember that the church is not Jesus. And so just because the church hurt you does not mean that Jesus is okay with that Jesus would have done that, or that Jesus did that to you. Jesus' love is more perfect than the love that Christians can show. That does not give Christians permission to show imperfect love and to not care about how they hurt people and just think, oh, well, Jesus will make up for it. But just to say, if you've been disappointed by the church, join the club. I think everyone has been disappointed by the church at some point, but we believe in the church because we believe in Jesus Christ who leads it, and we believe that he can make something good out of limited people. What I would want to push against, which can sometimes come out of this discussion, is the whole I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual perspective. To say, well, if Jesus is perfect and the church is imperfect, then why even bother with the church? Let's just have Jesus. And the thing is that human beings can't really have Jesus without the church. Jesus calls us to follow him, and he calls us to follow him with other people. And as soon as you have multiple people following Jesus together, you have the church. And so you can't be on an island with Jesus. It can't just be Jesus and me. Mm-hmm. It's Jesus and the church. And that's why we're continually striving to make the church better. But you can't, it's just so common today, and it always bothers me to say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Like that doesn't make sense if you're a Christian. Mm-hmm. You can't be following Jesus and not want to be part of the church. You may not want to be part of that church, mm-hmm. but you need to be a part of the church in some form or fashion. Mm-hmm. And so I want to encourage people that have been hurt by the church. I went through some very painful experiences in churches, and it took me a while to come back to them. But I still believe in the church, and there is so much good in the church. The church is the greatest cause for good in human history, and there's a reason to be a part of it.
Yeah. So don't forget, we've come to my last couple questions, so you can comment some questions that you might have. Throw those at Pastor Matt. He likes answering questions that he isn't prepared for. He finds that very enjoyable. So make sure you do that. So my last kind of question on topic is this: you one of the points you made is that encountering Jesus requires an act of trust on our part, right? And so I want to ask, how does this work out with the truth that we are saved by Jesus if it requires something done on our part?
Yeah, so this is a very controversial question in theological circles, and it hits at the point of two big schools of theology, or really the predestination and grace. And basically, the idea that a lot of people say is we are saved by grace. That means it's a completely free gift from Jesus. There's absolutely nothing that you do to receive it. You have no part in it. You just get it. And I don't agree with that. I don't find that in the Bible. I don't. The phrase "grace alone" is nowhere in the Bible. The phrase "faith alone" is only one place in the Bible, and that's in James, where it says, "You are not saved by faith alone." Now, I'm not saying that you earn your salvation, but the analogy that I use is, let's say that I need a heart transplant. Okay, and there is a doctor who is very skilled in giving heart transplants, and he's going to do the surgery for free because I can't afford it. Okay. However, one of the things you have to do when you go into surgery is you have to sign a consent form. I guess you also have to show up at the hospital and you have to let them put that mask on you and put you under. Now, the fact that I showed up, signed the document, and let them put the mask on, does that mean that I earned I earned the new heart that got put in me? Like, can I claim credit for having done the surgery? No, because those things don't fix my heart. They just put me in a place where the surgeon can fix my heart. The same thing is true of how we encounter Jesus. The fact that it requires an act on our behalf doesn't mean that I can take credit for being saved. It doesn't somehow mean that I've earned my spot with Jesus. It just means that I took the necessary steps to respond to what Jesus said. And it is consistent throughout, not even just the New Testament, but through the Old Testament, that God wants us to willingly choose him. It matters what we decide. And so that choice, that step to put faith in Jesus is our part, and it is required. It doesn't mean we can claim credit, and that's what people assume. As soon as you say, I have to do something to be saved, well, then that's works righteousness because you're earning salvation. No, I'm not earning it. I'm accepting it. I'm receiving it from Jesus. And so that's why we preach the gospel. That's why we invite people to come down. That's why we get baptized, is to receive and to respond to that call from Jesus.
Sure. All right, so we've come to my final question, which is completely off topic and kind of a random question. And I'm kind of using this time as a last call, per se, for any questions that you might have that you want to throw in the comments section. And so my question here, I told Matt before that it's kind of a question where maybe he doesn't necessarily have an answer for it, but maybe he has a story of someone else who has experienced this. It's probably not as wild as you think it's going to be or what you're expecting. I just want to ask, have you or anyone you know had any horror stories from preaching or teaching the Bible, or has someone had something happen to them on stage or something just wild and out that maybe is humorous or thought-provoking? I don't know, but
I've had a lot of nightmares.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of nightmares where, well, I don't know if nightmares are quite, I don't wake up in a cold sweat, but I have dreams about preaching going wrong and like not having the right notes and stuff like that. I don't have any really entertaining stories about it. I can tell you that I still have recordings of my very first sermons that I gave when I was in college, and they are embarrassing. Okay, here's one from the first time I ever taught. My youth pastor had me in a Sunday school class, and this isn't a very interesting story, but it embarrasses me to this day. I was teaching, and my youth pastor put a question mark on a piece of paper and held it up a couple of times, and I was like And my brain assumed he was disagreeing with me, and so I kept saying, "No, yeah, that's true. No, that's true. That's really what it says." And then I realized, no, he's telling me to stop and ask for questions. I'm still to this day embarrassed that I never. It was just such a. I'm sure it was a terrible lesson because I was like 16, 17. But it was just completely dense.
That reminds me of a time in camp where I had run like this wild personal change, and my youth pastor, she was co-directing the camp at this time, and I asked her, I was like, "Can I share my testimony?" She's like, "Yeah." She asked me more questions than just allowing me to do it, but I ended up doing it, and so it ends, right? And I was like, yeah, it was probably like 20 minutes, 15, 20. I might have went a little bit long. She comes up to me, she goes, "You know how long you went for?" I was like, 15, 20 minutes maybe. She's like, 45 minutes.
Wow.
We were at bonfire for 45 minutes because of my testimony. I was like, oh my gosh, that's a long one. She's like, yeah, I started all the way in the back of the benches, and I kept scooting and scooting and scooting to the point where she was right next to me by the time I ended. So, yeah, that's something that happened with me in high school too. So
it is easy to go long. It's harder to go short.
Yeah. Yep. So that's a fun one. But also, just talking about the college sermons. The one that I sent you was a college sermon from my first internship, and I was like, man, I don't know if I should have sent that sermon to him as like an example of me preaching, because I've come a long way since then, but that's what I had on video. So.
Well, it's not like we weren't hiring you to take over the pulpit.
That's true.
This is where, this is a place where you're going to learn to do that.
Yeah.
And I think you do pretty well.
Sure. So, all right, well, doesn't look like we had any questions pop in there for today. And so we're going to wrap things up. Don't forget that next week we are back here on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Studio A. Yeah. And so that's where we're at right now. And anyway, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. Some good stuff that we talked about today. I really enjoyed the sermon on Sunday. So, yeah, join us again next week as we will be talking about something else. I don't know what. Matthew. Not
me. Another Matthew.
Yeah, a different Matthew.
The one from the Bible.
Yeah. They're probably like, I don't care about Pastor Matt. I want to know about Matthew, right?
Right.
Anyway. Yep. So, yeah, join us as we talk about Matthew next week. Should be a good time again. So, anyway, I am Pastor Jack, and he is...
Pastor Matt. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord.